Good afternoon. It is Thursday, January 23rd. You are welcome to walk behind me. And I am glad to be back here with you all. So yesterday we heard a presentation from the administration about some fee changes in our education delivery system, governance, and finance system. And a lot of that was based on a proposal for a new foundation formula. We talked about foundation formulas here before, but wanted to have the consultants from the AOE who have been working on this for a little while to come in so we can actually drill down a little bit deeper into like what are the essential building blocks that they have built into the foundation formula that they're talking about. Because that's really like where the rubber hits the road on that. And committee members who have been here for a while might remember like going really deep into sort of what makes up the weights and math behind weights before. But that's also, I know, a newer conversation for lots of members of the committee. So really glad to have the folks from APA joining us. Thank you. I think you're going to start off with some degree of presentation for us, and then we're going to spend some time asking questions.
Makes a lot of sense.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so hi, Justin Silverstein with Augenblick Palacian Associates. We usually go by APA Consulting. Denver-based consulting firm. We've been doing work with states on school finance since actually the early 1980s. Neither of us were there at that time. I've worked in all 50 states and really have helped states think through the equity of their systems, the structure of their systems, and the adequacy of their systems. I've been doing some work here in Vermont for the past couple of years in different ways, worked with the legislature on the CTE study. I've been working with the AOE, some additional work on career and tech ed, and then also doing some work with Listen and Learn meetings that were done throughout the fall and the winter, and then helping here with this proposal. So we are going to get into a level of detail that you have seen with the policy brief, but try to get a little bit more specific on how we are looking at that. There will be, more explicit and full numbers coming soon. We are just trying to reconcile is probably the wrong word, but working through with JFO staff and others to make sure that we can agree on all the math before everything gets individual specific figures come out. But you'll really the theory of action and kind of what we're building on and how we're building it coming out of today.
Okay. So we want to first a quick overview of when we talk about what's in the proposed funding formula. It goes back to those conversations we've been having around what's a foundation formula or student-based formula look like. And so within the proposed funding formula are a few different components. The first being an evidence-based per pupil amount. That really represents what is the funding that's needed for any student. So a student with no additional need in a school or district that has no additional characteristics that might require extra funding. So what's that base, the floor of what funding you would provide to your students? Then you have adjustments that are usually through weights, and most of them will be through weights from our proposed formula to address student needs. So that includes economically disadvantaged students, English learners, CTE students, also can include preschool. We'll talk about that. And then categorical funding for special education is what we're still proposing as part of the funding approach. And then you also have a series of adjustments to address school and district characteristics. So you've addressed student characteristics. You also want to address for circumstances such as scale, which is a big topic of conversation in Vermont, and then geographic sparsity.
I just have a vocabulary question. When you say adjustments in your third bullet, are you referring to weights or some other method of adjustment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we use adjustments and weights a little bit interchangeably, but weight I think would be the appropriate.
Okay. And so whenever you say the word adjustment, you mean weight?
We will try to use weight whenever we mean weight.
Yeah, that's a good point of clarification. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
But just to clarify, so I understand you, I think what you're saying is that the adjustment is a dollar amount that you've determined through evidence is needed to educate students, for example, who are disadvantaged. So it's an additional dollar amount.
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit more as we get specifics into those individual weights, but we think of it two ways, which is the additional dollar amount, but also the concept of like the total dollars needed for specific types of students. So
Okay.
we'll get a little bit more specific
But
on
it does
that.
correspond to a dollar amount.
Exactly. right.
Exactly. The weight is just an expression of the difference between the base amount and that targeted amount of additional funding that you want to see for students. But it's very specifically a way to drive the dollars that we want to see spent. No, I feel like I made it worse.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get there. Okay. So then to establish the parameters of what's in the proposed formula, we took a number of different pieces. First, looking at the current funding system components, approaches used in other states, and findings from other adequacy studies, again, building on APA's experience working across the country in this area. And then you also really have a wealth of research that's been done specifically for Vermont and what resources are needed to serve your students. So we were very lucky not to be walking into a situation where everything had to be built from scratch. You really have a lot of good research that's been done by very reputable firms using reputable and rational approaches to get there. So this is just a handful of the studies that have been done in your state over the past several years, looking again, what should your base funding be? What should additional funding be for certain student groups? So throughout the presentation, we're going to refer back to this because our theory of action here was not to start from scratch, to really leverage what was already out there to put together the best system possible from all the points of information that you already had. Okay, so I want to start off with the base and then Justin will talk more about the weights specific there. We started with establishing an evidence-based base amount. Then we started with the PICUS Common work that came out in September of last year that identified what are those resources needed for the base level to serve all students. So a little background on the evidence-based approach. There's really 4 approaches to adequacy that have been used across the country. The evidence-based being one of these approaches that identifies a specific set of resources needed to serve students and then applies prices, salaries, and benefits to come up with a cost. There's also the professional judgment approach, which is similar in that it identifies resources, but really more relies on the experience of educators in a state to identify what those are. So those are the 2 that we think about as kind of input-based approaches that build from the ground up. There's also a cost function approach that looks at your current spending and data and attempts to extrapolate out to a higher level of performance. And then successful schools or districts that also looks at your current data and estimates what spending is needed to get the level of performance that you're seeing. And those we think about as more output-based approaches. Circling back to the evidence-based, again, it's one of those 4 approaches that's been used across the country. It's also the basis of the funding system in Arkansas and Wyoming. Both of those states are subject to court decisions. So it's also an approach that has been validated through their court decisions as a rational means of meeting their state's legal requirements. And again, caveat, every state is very different around what are the rules and expectations coming out of those court decisions. The evidence-based model is really coming from a theory of action of looking at the available research and best practice to identify the resources that are needed in a set of what they call prototype schools or districts. And they have a very specific model about how they think resources should be used, but it's also a means of just identifying a total amount of funding that should be needed. So we're going to talk about very specifically the resources they recommend, but I want to caveat everything with it. That's not to say that it's a prescriptive way that local communities would have to use those dollars. It's a means of getting to what would be an amount of funding that's needed. Okay. So this, again, digging into what the starting point for the proposed funding model is, in the EB model, it identifies a number of key resources that I've summarized here. You'll see a chart, but I do encourage folks, it's really well laid out in the PICUS and Auden report, the depth and rationale behind these pieces. One of the biggest drivers is the class size.
And sorry, again, to clarify, you are just sort of re-describing to us what is in the PICUS Auden report at this point.
Exactly.
You're not moving it to your model yet.
Not just yet. Yeah.
And just for folks, there's a table like deep in the report, like maybe halfway through, that is like sort of the key moment in the report.
Yeah, no, I think that is great. So key resources, class sizes 15:1, K through 3, 25:1, 4 through 12. It also has specials or electives teachers to ensure planning and collaboration time, as well as robust offerings for students. It has additional instructional support, including coaches, interventionists, library media specialists, student support, including counselors and nurses, principal and assistant principal in high schools, just a principal in elementary and middle, and secretarial staff. And then supervisory aides cover duties and protect teacher planning time. So those are the school level based resources. It also identifies a set of resources at the administrative, kind of the system or district level that are not summarized in this presentation, but would be in that PICUS non report. So that is where we're starting from. What the evidence base, the best practice and academic research would say are the resources needed to serve students. So then to take that work and better fit it to kind of Vermont's context and priorities, we're making a number of recommendations to adjust that base, that then would be the base we would recommend for this proposed funding formula. And for a little context on APA, we have worked with PICUS and Auden in about 5 states right now. As they're implementing the EV approach, we have evidence-based approach, sorry. During that process, we usually are concurrently implementing that professional judgment approach. So bringing in educators to look at the resources that the research would suggest, and then making changes and adjustments to fit their state's context. So we have AP as a team has a lot of familiarity with the EV model and also the common changes that are made by educators from state to state. Because there's a number of areas that tend to come up in the EV model of not having the resources they would want to see. So we have familiarity with that. So our goal with these adjustments, again, was to fit the Vermont context. First off of that, and this won't be part of the base conversation, but when we talk about those weights adjustments for size, the EV model as it's laid out had a lot bigger schools in it than Vermont typically has. The base was based on elementaries and middle schools of 450 students versus high schools of 600. And your average school size in Vermont is more like 200 students. They're much smaller. So one of the first considerations is really how you take that model and adjust it for Vermont's scale, both where it is now and perhaps where it wants to go in the future. We also incorporated the feedback that we're hearing from the community during the Listen and Learn tour. What we're hearing is really strong values of the community. And ones we'll touch on it at the end that really stood out to us was the needs around student mental health and access to career and college readiness, like coursework and preparation and exploration, that those are some things that communities really value. So you'll hear some of that. And then key priorities for the state, again, CTE, college and career readiness. So we tried to take what was somewhat of a national model put forward in the PICUS and Auden report and make it more Vermont specific and tailored. So those will be the adjustments.
And you said you've worked with PICUS and Auden and I just want to name for the committee. I know I'm doing an amazing thing where I told everyone to wait and I'm asking clarifying questions and that's my chair's prerogative. I'm going to do it. So when you say that you've been collaborating with PICUS and Auden in other states, would you describe that as what you're doing here or you?
That's a good clarify
I
that.
think we are directly.
Like a cough drop.
I actually have one and then it's not made me cough more. So
Okay, great.
it's perfect. And I don't have a cough. I just put it in. Yeah, it's great. No, we are not collaborating directly with Larry and we work mostly with Larry PICUS right now. He's absolutely offered to review the information that we have done, as we go forward so he is not putting a stamp of approval on this. He's not saying this is the right way to do it. What we are doing is taking the adjustments we've made as we've reconciled those two approaches in all these other states and saying, what were the things that we did in every state? We would assume we'd want to do that here too. What are the things that based on Vermont's context and similar in other states we've worked in that we'd also want to add? And I think as Amanda's talking here, with the Listen and Learn, we've also in other states had other stakeholder engagement, right? When we've heard X, we want to make sure we're doing Y to the EV model. So we're leveraging that information, but not working directly with it.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so all that to say, we recommend a number of adjustments to what was put forward in that PICUS and Auden report. First being the PICUS and Auden report staffs electives and specials kind of more richly at the high school level versus the elementary and middle school level in its model. But what we were hearing from the community was again for the need for robust course offerings in middle school, that career exploration and exposure that lended itself to needing more specials or electives teachers in the middle school setting. So we made that adjustment. We have also added additional teaching positions at the high school level to offer that college and career readiness coursework. knowing that when you start to get into advanced coursework, you tend to have smaller class sizes. It also would offer the ability for high schools to have CTE or career and technical education programming at the school outside of the CTE center. So trying to embed some of that within the school. Adding additional student support. This is probably the biggest thing that's been coming up as we've done this work in other states, is that the EB model does not have the level of student support or mental health staffing that most communities and educators think is important. So we've made that adjustment. We've also added assistant principals at the elementary and middle school level. That's both consistent with kind of how Vermont schools are staffed now, and again, what we've heard nationally. We also adjusted the nursing staff level. The EB model is based on a ratio of 700 to 1. But Vermont education quality standards are actually 500 to 1. So that's another place we made an adjustment to the national model to better fit Vermont. We are also looking at increasing teacher salaries so we can better ensure pay equity across the state. So that you'll see in the Picus and Ogden report, they take those resources and then apply average salaries and benefits to them. So we're looking to increase the average teacher salary that we're using to fund the model. Yeah.
How did you make that decision?
Yeah, good question. Just
Yeah, so we were modeling, so there's two questions, like how do we make the decision generally? I think generally we made the decision because we've heard, a struggle to attract qualified staff. So that was the why. The amount, which will, again, as we do the full numbers we'll talk about, was kind of looking at what a lot of other states have looked at and said that kind of, this was an amount, a number of states are looking to target additionally for teachers. So that's where we are.
That's definitely one of those policy decision pieces that's not been fiction. And then additional per student kind of funding for CT in middle and high school, as well as to support flex pathways. So those are all components that we recommend be part of the base funding. And this table just summarizes what that looks like. Again, this is not all the resources. This is really the school level staffing and places we made changes. We did not make changes to the district level staffing or any of the non-personnel supplies and materials or student activities costs that were identified in the Picus and Ogden report. So you're not seeing the entire picture here. I just want to clarify that. But it just shows you for the prototype schools, the 450 elementary, 450 middle, and 600 high school, what the staffing would look like when you apply those 15 to 1 in your lowest grades, 25 to 1 and up. Where's highlight is places we made a change from what you would see in the Picus and Ogden report that we talked about on the prior page.
And are those all adjustments upwards?
Those are adjustments
Yes.
upwards. Mhm. Yeah. And again, I'm going to say it one more time. This is not intended to be a prescriptive means then of how funding is used, but again, a rational way of getting to what should that base amount look like. And with that, I will switch over to Justin to talk about weights for a minute.
All right, so I'm gonna probably go off script. Amanda put together a great presentation and then I
We tried too many words in this.
I think one of the things that we really appreciate about the evidence-based model is that provides everyone, and including policymakers, a really firm understanding of what's going into that cost, right? So you know exactly the number of people, the prices that are being applied to it. It would allow policymakers over time to take a look under the hood, keep track of if that's the right configuration of resources, the right prices for those resources, right? You can think about recosting at some level that base amount every year. So as we went into the work on the weights, we also wanted to do as best we could find kind of resource specific information where we could. And so what we know about the Act 127 weights, they are really focused on student capacity and not, taxing capacity, not weights that drive a specific dollar amount, right? So they do not tell us an EL student needs, making up a number, $5,000 worth of additional resources to meet state standards. And they were derived from a process, which was the cost function, that is a very reputable process. It was done by the right people. That process never tells you what the resources are under the hood. They tell you the percentage amount additional. And so what we were looking at is, kind of thinking through that piece, reviewing the current expenditure data that is demonstrating that though additional capacity has been provided to high need communities, many of those high need communities are not currently taking and leveraging that additional capacity, which means they won't necessarily have the additional resources needed for those students, right?
And that
So
was just expenditure data from the last year.
yes, so we have there's only the 1 year of data right now with the Act 127. So taking a look at that data, exactly right. And so what we did is kind of went back to all of that information that Amanda laid out with all those different studies that have been done, plus information from other states, adequacy studies and current pieces to really try to understand kind of what's best practice around weights, and really more importantly, to best practice about the targeted amount of funding needed, which then gets turned into a weight. I think you can have these conversations and you can look into states who recently changed their formulas and they just talk about, well, let's use a 0.25 weight because some other state uses a 0.25 weight. Well, Maryland using a 1.0 weight for their at-risk population on a $9,000 base is the same as someone else using a 0.5 weight, right, on, I would have to be better at math in my head, on a much higher base, right? So the weight itself doesn't tell you as much as you might think, because really what we're trying to think about is what's the additional resources needed for kids. So what we try to do is go look at all that information and then generate where we could weights where we had specific base amounts and really think about the targeted funding. So that was the kind of what we were trying to do.
I tried for you. Okay. I'm gonna let you just find.
And so we looked at a number of things. And so for your economically disadvantaged students, the current weight, again, 1.03. The studies that we were looking at was the task force report on weights, which had the current weight. I would also say, I can't remember exactly the page, in that report, there is information about kind of an estimate of, I think, about $10,600 as the additional funding for that 1.03, which kind of implies a base of about a 10,300. So we had those dollar figures to work with.
Was that from Professor Colby's report or the task force's?
I believe it was from the task force's report, the December 2021 report,
And I'll offer to you that Professor Colby agreed with that section of the report.
which is fair, totally fair.
Has agreed.
Disagreed.
Disagreed. Thank you. Sorry. Make sure.
Disagreed, took some issue.
Great. But again, kind of going back to the AIR report, there was a number without a base, right? So you couldn't, so
Exactly.
it was a place to go to, right, to start. But what we don't have underneath that 1.03 is any information of like what it was meant to purchase, right? What are the programs and interventions that were designed for the student? From the EB study, we have that kind of information of the what, and it generates a base. That report identifies a base between 0.34, if you're assuming half of a weight, yes, of a 0.34. If you're assuming that only half your economically disadvantaged students receive extended day and after school, or a weight of 0.49 if you assume all economically disadvantaged students have those additional services. And so that's kind of the range of weights in that report. And then what we were looking at is taking a look really at that kind of scale of additional funding and total funding coming really more from the task force report, in part because the evidence base focuses almost exclusively on additional instructional needs of students and doesn't have really anything else for the additional wraparound supports you might expect for economically disadvantaged students. So social work or psychologists, those sort of reports. So we are targeting kind of the other total amount of money. That weight would be less than 1.03. It would be more than even the 0.49. It's going to be somewhere in that range when applied to the base that we're coming out with evidence base. It would be one of the higher weights in the country. And again, we'll come out with, this is a hard one, when we come out with the really specific weight soon that you'll see, but it wouldn't be the highest weight in the country by any means.
And you just explained how, the weight only matters in relationship to the base. So are you saying it's the higher weight just as an absolute number or in relationship to?
As an absolute number, I think the total amount of funding would actually be similar to what you would see in some other states with the highest weight. So we can definitely talk about that.
And then I'm really seeing a lot of this first meeting with you as an opportunity where we're going to need further
Yeah,
money, right?
yeah.
So, have you consulted with Professor Colby and that team about this work you've done yet, or is that something we're going to need to have them in for?
We have not yet. We'd love to be able, but I think that happening would be really important and happy to be a part of it if it's helpful and productive and happy to, to help out in any way possible.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for the EL work, the current weight is 2.49. Again, we talked about weights don't have a lot of meaning without a base, but in any way, shape, or form, the 2.49 is by far the highest weight that you would see or in that realm around the country right now, but not necessarily the highest weight that you've seen in some studies, right? So trying to balance that out. The work we have, our understanding of the original UVM AIR report was a weight of about 1.58. The EB weight range, again, the two numbers, it's really less a range than two numbers. And it really, again, is under the theory of action of either 50% of the English learners taking the extended day services or 100%, but it could have a weight up to 0.58. And then again, there was a study about a year ago, I think, January of 2024, that focused on using some work we've actually done. So we were trying not to act as if like that was the best work ever, but we think it was, building on some work that APA has done in Ohio, looking at the additional services English learners need, taking a similar approach and talking to EL educators in this state about what is needed for students to meet state standard, and identified, I believe, FY school year 22-23 dollar amount of around $19,845 additional dollars per EL student. Want to make the point here, those who were able to see the presentation yesterday, there was a really nice chart of the gaps that you have in student performance that you probably couldn't see every box on because it was up on a screen. Your EL performance is just barely higher than your special ed performance right now. Like EL performance, and it's not just a Vermont issue, right? EL performance generally is really low across the country. And this is a place I would say for school finance experts, we are working our hardest to get the best understanding of what's needed. But I think there's the least consensus on exactly what needs to happen. I just think to be transparent there.
And I just want to offer that it's confusing to be comparing weights to dollars
Yeah.
in a single slide when it's not clear when you talk about that weight, what base you're putting that weight on.
And I think
So it makes it hard to interpret what you're explaining to us.
absolutely
I
appreciate that.
understand that's also part of what's hard with the work we've been doing.
And I believe in the EL report, and I could have just misread it, there wasn't, again, a base that this number was put on top of. So that was the other piece we had there.
And then the category, and I'm going to wait to ask about the categorical.
Okay.
Representative Holcomb.
I'm just a little confused because
Yeah.
I don't understand how you do a weight without a base in your particular formula. So I'm very curious, what is actually the base you're using to generate that? I also genuinely do not understand why the Colby study is up there as a comparison, because it is not a foundation plan. So there's a fundamental difference between weighting that drives a dollar amount, that's a supplemental amount that's needed to educate students. The Colby study was not asked to do that task. This is an apples to oranges comparison, because the Colby study was asked, how do you weight on the tax side, the tax capacity, to equalize tax capacity? It's not, I don't understand why you're comparing those weights to your weights at all.
And just for clarification, are you referring to the EL the
Well,
student?
just in general, the UVM AIR, I mean, all of that work was done around our existing funding formula. It's not like we have the same funding formula when you're moving to a foundation plan. So it's a fundamentally different conversation. So I'm not sure why you're comparing those weights.
I think, no, I think it's a great comment and a great question, because there is that disconnect right now between studies and your current system that have been done on the tax capacity side. So we are trying to situate that in what other information is also available on what the resources need to be. Because, for example, the EB study is intended to identify the resources that are necessary. So I would say it's more similar in that way to the Colby report. It's another way of thinking about what total dollars are you need. But I hear you that we are mixing two things here and it's not particularly clear. But that's why
I'm
we're
just not sure, what are we supposed to take away from the fact that the UVM AIR report weight was 1.58?
Yeah, I appreciate that.
It has nothing to do with the conversation about weights in the foundation.
It's more just providing information about what people may be thinking about around weights in the state already. But again, with that really important caveat that all of your weights and all of your studies have been around tax capacity and not spending.
And can you,
Thank you.
okay, well, it'd be helpful to understand the base.
Will.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, and that number will absolutely, we're working to get that piece out as soon as
And I
possible.
think it's, and I think as soon as we move to dollar amounts, sometimes we remove ourselves from understanding what created that dollar amount. And so I'm perfectly fine at some level with us not having the dollar amount yet and just understanding the ingredients that led you to that dollar amount, because I think it'll help us have more open minds about the ingredients before we get to the cake.
And I appreciate that. And the Colby, the January EL report, I think, my understanding of both the methodology, since it built on our methodology, it is more analogous to an evidence-based or professional judgment approach, which is to identify the services, because it actually laid out the services and it costed out those services to get to a total dollar amount. Again, my understanding of that report. So that is actually the number that we focused most on, was the Vermont educators, EL educators, who came together and said, here's really what we need for students in order to get to provide the services they need. And so as we are building an EL weight, we're really taking that information as one of our driving pieces of information. Now, again, it did not have a base, but this was a absolute additional funding request. And so we're working through that piece.
Yeah, but I think we could be much clearer.
We're gonna let you
Okay.
keep going.
All right. Okay.
And sorry, so you did say our recommendation will be to a weight that will generate dollars at a similar level to that.
Great. And then CTE, no specific weight from the Act 127 additional weights. We've been doing a lot of work on CTE. A couple big things here, right? First, we are trying to take a look at kind of what are the costs. And when I say CTE, it's really students being served in a CTE center. The first is going to be really a recommendation around CTE governance. And so that is really thinking through having those about 5,000 students or about 3,000 FTE who are in CTE. All the centers being overseen by, for lack of a better term right now, kind of a CTE BOCES, who's really directing the programming, the professional development, all of the, kind of the whole piece of CTE, and having the dollars delivered to them to then fund out to the centers themselves. It's in alignment with one of the recommendations we had in our original governance report for the legislature, was to have those dollars kind of stop having the battle between districts currently and the CTE center. With part of that, having some of the base cost remain with the home district, so that they can take care of those other services that they continue to have. So guidance, counseling, and mental health and things for their students. Again, this is really based on current expenditures and talking to the CTE sector on what it takes to actually get the job done currently, and building in, with that additional dollar staying at the home district, some incentive to even get maybe more kids to the CTE programs.
And I think the questions will naturally come up as we go along about how much portion stays with the sending district and how much portion stays with the CTE, and how, what does a weight even mean in that context? And
Yes,
I imagine we'll get further into that.
yes, we'll have that laid out when we get to those numbers. Absolutely. Okay, I can,
When they say we'll get the full weight, are they talking about the weights now, or are they talking about the base?
When you say a full weight, do you mean a weight or a base?
so we will create a weight for CTE, which would generate the funding at that $25,000 level. Many programs, as you all know, are full-time CTE programs. And so that would basically, you'd have a full-time FTE, they would receive the full weight. There are other programs that are only half-time.
But who-
When he says weight. because-
Who gets the base?
The base would go to the home district. And then the additional funding for CTE would go to the CTE,
Separate from the base.
separate from the base.
So it would be like a second base, a CTE base.
Yeah, it'd be, yes, it will come out as a weight effectively, right? It would be, for every CTE student, there'll be a weight. Those dollars would go directly to the CTE governance, the BOCES.
And then I think we will need a diagram when we get
Yes.
to that, because then there's a question of, does the EL weight for the CTE student hang out with the CTE weight, or does the EL weight for the CTE student hang out with the district?
Yeah,
That's a good question.
And then is there a base for the CTE that your weight's going on top of, or is it only a weight?
Only a weight on the same base that's for every student.
Yeah, we'll map it up. I appreciate that. Those
It's
are
gonna be a
all,
lot easier to talk about once we have the number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, no, appreciate it.
Representative Mazza.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but there was concern in the committee when we first reviewed Dr. Colby's, which was show us your homework. I
Mhm.
mean, we didn't know how she got to where she got, and eventually we got closer to understanding. And so don't need to go back to Dr. Colby's work, but as you bring forward weights, it would be very helpful to know, show us your homework, how you got there.
Yeah.
Some of us would like to know, and I think the chair's idea of having a diagram is also very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And our goal will be to have calculations that would be replicable and someone else can do those at any time and we can pass off to you.
Thank you for registering.
Yeah. Okay, I will do this one and then, so preschool, two more. Current, in the current funding system, it's a really negative 0.54. And so you're effectively getting a 0.46 kind of FTE for every preschool student. Looking at the 2023 pre-kindergarten report recommendation of having that be at least a 1.0. So those students funded at a full FTE. We absolutely agree with that recommendation. So the proposal and the map will come out at a 1.0. We would make the point that right now, we have not made a recommendation on the early essential education students, but we're not saying that there shouldn't be a change there. We just we don't have a recommendation.
And does this match a proposal that requires all schools to offer full day preschool for all 4-year-olds?
That's a good
So-
question.
The pre-K committee released a report. I don't believe there's,
I know I'm wondering the proposal that all these weights go with, that's about to come from the agency, does that include a full day preschool for 4-year-olds? And this is just, this is one detail of just trying to understand, do the weights match the policy proposal we're reading?
yeah, for the full day for 4-year-olds, yes. I wouldn't want to circle back on the committee. But yes, sorry.
Oh, Jill Campbell, thank you.
In the corner.
Interim Deputy Secretary, Agency of Education. Our intention is that the pre-K proposal, the CTE proposal will all be in line with this proposal. So I will confess that I have not been involved in the pre-K work as much as on the other side, the CTE side. So let me confirm.
Representative Holcomb?
So maybe I'm trying to get past the fact that we might be double weighting CTE students, but I want to think about the pre-K students because when Pikus did his report, his assumption was that all pre-K would be offered within the public school system. And we do not do that in Vermont. And in fact, the report that's coming back has disregarded the recommendation of the legislature and is going with the mandatory voucher program at pre-K. So are you going to have to adjust your weights to reflect that report recommendation is not in line with Pikus?
I think that is a good question that we can dig into more. I think where we were coming from is from the evidence that we see, we don't see a reason that you would discount the cost of preschool students the way that your system currently does. So our recommendation is to count them as a full student within the system. The recommendation coming out of that pre-K report was that the cost of those students might be even higher than a 1.0, but there wasn't one recommended right now. So at this moment, our recommendation for the funding model itself is to count preschool students as a full-time student and not a partial. I think that the larger policy conversation that you're talking about is something that needs to happen that's a bit separate from this idea that you at least count them as a full-time student. I think it fits in the bucket of if you're seeing cost differentials, you would then want to adjust your funding system to account for that. But this is where we're waiting for recommendation right now.
Thanks. And I think one of the things we've been working through for a long time is whether the policy should drive the funding or the funding should drive the policy. And I think we've all entered this year thinking that the policy should drive the funding, and just want to make sure we're lining that up as we go forward.
No, I think that makes sense. And where I come from as working in school finance is a bit to try to make your finance system, your financial policy, a little agnostic to your policy choices. So to have it be a system that can be responsive to the policy choices you then layer on top of it. So for example, we'll talk about it in a minute, like looking at a size adjustment. You want your system to be responsive to the different cost pressures that a school system might face be smaller. It would then be a policy choice, a separate piece to think about what are the sizes of schools that we think should really be in practice or necessary in our system. So the funding system itself, you want the structure and the mechanics of it to allow for the policy to change to happen over time separate from that. Does that mean,
Yeah,
you articulate that a little better?
I think we're with you, which is a funding system should support the education system and the education policy system. It should not drive it,
Yeah,
right? And so what we want to do is create a system that is flexible enough
yeah.
that when you make policy decisions, we can make an adjustment into the funding system to ensure that it can be implemented in the correct way. So we're 100% with you there. This is where we were in understanding the current policy, but I think if something were to shift, I think what's great about even your current weighted system, you can make adjustments based on the policies that you're making. It shouldn't be the other direction for sure.
And I think one of the challenges we have with our current system is we're incentivizing behavior at the district level that might not be the policy choices that we would make if we were doing it purposefully. What I hear you saying is that you are building a model that that might not even match with the policy proposals right now and will need to be further adjusted as further policy changes are made.
Yes, I think we want to make sure everything is in alignment when we go down. I think what Amanda will show an example of is a policy kind of suggestion that we are making for implementation that would require kind of further refinement as you get to full implementation, right? But what's great about the foundation formula is it would allow you to do that. And I think you're also absolutely right. What's really good about foundation formula is it's directing up, right? It is saying, here's the policy, here's a funding system that supports that policy. And now we're kind of putting the dollars into the system in that direction, right? In that directionality, whereas the current policy allows a lot of district choice that might be completely disconnected from what your policy decisions are. And I think part of that's what we're in part seeing is districts who did not take up the new capacity to generate more dollars for higher need kids, right? That was a disconnect between what you had hoped, I think, would happen, right? What you would allow to happen in the system and then what actually happened. All right, special education students. Currently funded through the census block grant. Special education study recommended keeping the census block grant, and that noted that current special education spending was higher, at the time of study was higher than needed. What we are really looking at is absent further study, keeping the census block grant to fund education. But what we also are really making sure we identify is that there are current special education costs that are not funded either through the feds or the census block grant. They are actually in local district decisions and budgets. It's about, I think, around $70 million in total. And so we need to take that amount of money into consideration as we complete our policy recommendation.
And is that the only block grant you're planning on maintaining?
No, and I do not have them all in front of me, but just the ones I can, transportation, you're gonna, would still need to be there and need to consider, again, it's kind of half, it's at a half now. So the other half is sitting in local budgets. So we have to think about how you balance that. There are parts of CTE you might keep. There's the EEE, right? There's a number that I think you have. We are mapping, and we've worked with JFO to start on the mapping of what could be pulled into the funding, into the foundation formula funding side, and what would need to stay out. But there would be a number of grants that would continue.
So,
And I think just to name for the committee, I think there's an outstanding question. There was an outstanding question when we did the special education block grants about whether they should be weighted or not. There was a question when we did the weights, how they should be applied to special education or not. And I imagine that balance will need to be resolved here as well.
so we touched on the student weights, kind of going back to something I said at the beginning, the PICUS and Auden base is based on much larger schools than you see in Vermont now. So you need to think about how do you design the funding formula to be responsive to the fact that you have schools of different sizes. And schools of different sizes cost different amounts to run. Because you have some fixed costs that if you spread that over fewer students, it's going to increase how much you spend per kiddo in a smaller setting. So for context, your current Act 127 rates provide some additional funding for schools that are small. So there's a weight for a tax capacity weight for schools that are under 100 students and another weight for schools that are 100 to 250 students. And right now, the policy choice around that is that it's only applied to schools that are in sparsely populated areas. So that's another kind of that example of the mechanics of a formula versus the policy choice. The where do you apply it was the policy choice that's happening right there. The Vermont studies that came before the Act 127 weights were a little bit higher coming out at UVM-AIR than where they ended up. The evidence base, as we touched on, does not adjust for scale and did, at least in the report, acknowledge that Vermont schools are much smaller and that was something to be considered. Again, I think we said this before, the prototype schools at the base are really kind of your most efficient point. So if we think about kind of a traditional school funding curve, that's the floor. And then you adjust up from there for places that are more costly. So our recommendation right now is to provide differentiated weighting by size that is more similar to the weights that were coming out of the UVM-AIR study with some adjustments. So the adjustments that we think you need, as I mentioned right now, it's just 2 weights in your system, one for under 100 students and 100 to 250 students. So it's kind of a tiered approach. We would recommend using a formula instead to make a smooth curve, because you can have some really big consequential differences, say if you have 99 students or 101. So you want to smooth out what we would call funding cliffs when you apply adjustments like that.
The existing weights also have a dependency approach, which is, it's sort of like a mathematical attempt at geographically necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the small school weight only applies if there's the sparsity weight. Have you duplicated that at all?
Yeah, and that's one of the other recommended changes that we're suggesting for right now is to remove that piece of it for now, to give the small school adjustment to any school based on its enrollment. And our suggestion is to provide is to, knowing that the evidence-based model, again, is based on much larger school sizes than 250 students, that you would continue to provide weighted funding for schools that are 250 down to that base size of 450. And allow, instead of right now, you kind of cap out at the maximum of additional funding you provide to schools that are under 100 students. We would suggest allowing the formula to run to provide even further compensation for schools that are less than 100 students. And again, we've modeled this as kind of a formula that you can see. And this is where I then want to make the distinction around the policy criteria. So this is the first pieces are the suggestion for the adjustment that you would have in your funding formula for size. The question of who's eligible to receive that adjustment is a separate, larger policy conversation of what does it mean to be necessarily small or small by choice. So right now, your system is setting that necessarily small requirement around being in a sparsely populated area. So that's a choice that you can make as policymakers to say we only provide that funding in those sparsely populated areas. You could take into account other considerations, often distance between a similar building is a consideration. Capacity of buildings that are near each other could be another piece of the puzzle to keep in mind. So I think there's a set of criteria that would need to be developed and applied, but at least for the beginning transition period, funding every school to at least push that until that change can be made.
And I think that's the key. Like, we don't want these new districts to start on the back foot where they have a lot of small settings that cost more money and you're pulling dollars from one place to another to make sure that you can have that equal educational opportunity, right? It is not something we would want to see 10 years from now, that every small school receives, this adjustment. Then you'd want to get to the place of only necessarily small. It's that transition piece and knowing that we're getting to a base number built on, a school governance size structure that isn't what's in place today. So giving some time to transition.
Representative Odie, and I was about to say I was in the middle of saying Representative Odie, and then Holcomb, that you had matching hands, but you're good, Representative Holcomb.
Okay.
Okay, Representative Odie.
And so you referenced the UVM AIR report. Did you also look at the updated memos?
I don't think I've reviewed all of them, but I
They have
have,
different numbers.
do they have different, okay, I'll take a look at that. Thank you so much for highlighting that. Again, you have a wealth of information out there. We want to make sure we get all of it, so appreciate it.
Representative Holcomb.
I think it's also worth pointing out that we don't actually weight schools, we weight districts.
Mhm.
And there's a significant difference.
Yeah, and we
And
are,
the same concern about putting weights into a tax capacity formula versus a foundation formula applies here as well. And relates to the fact that you really can't be agnostic to purposes of funding because that's how you drive your weights.
Representative Maslin, and then we're gonna, yeah,
Briefly,
got a perfect circle going on around
thank
here.
you for using the word, the terminology necessarily small. I think we all sort of generally around the room understand what that is. As you work forward, it's certainly something that some people can quibble about. And personally, I'd rather have it be pretty clear to the extent that it can be clear.
and I think what's interesting is that what the definition of necessarily small can be very different from state to state. I think you need to have a state definition and criteria of what that means.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yes, but I think there's less than 10 states that provide funding for what they consider necessarily small, and their criteria are different from place to place. Yeah, so we should have a clear one for Vermont, just naming that there's not a commonly accepted one kind of national. Thank you. So right now, within the current system, you also adjust for district sparsity, and you can see the kind of the breakdown and tiers that are there. You do not currently have any weighting for size of district outside of the size of schools that we touched on in the last one, which you're right, is funded at the district level. The weights coming out of the task force were the same, while the UVM AR study had the same thresholds in terms of population, but higher weights. And we'll go back to look at the memos to see how did those weights really change over time. And the EV model does not adjust for scale. So our recommendation is kind of recognizing that sparsely populated rural areas face higher cost pressures, higher costs of doing business. We would recommend continuing to adjust for sparsity. We do not have a lot of other information about what that should look like. So we would recommend keeping your current approach and exploring changes in the future as necessary. And then thinking about the size piece of it, given that this funding model, and this comes back to, I think, your question about the funding policy, can't be entirely agnostic, is with the proposed governance change, we don't recommend an additional district size adjustment because all of the proposed districts would be above the 3,900 kind of prototypical district size coming out of the Ficus Nodden report, which is where they really identified that's the point of efficiency, where your costs on a per student level stay about the same once you get over that scale threshold. If there's a different policy choice made to have keep your current governance structure, then you would also need an additional adjustment for district size, because then there are higher costs to operate a much smaller district than 4,000 students. So it's not modeled in here now, but if there was a different policy choice, the system would need to change.
And now,
We've been doing
questions.
I want to make sure I'm sort of understanding what you all are laying out on a very basic level, separate from the details. What I think I heard you saying, and I'm not sure about, is that you're essentially sort of laying out a framework for fully funding what is, but through a foundation formula. And you're suggesting that through policy changes, we then move from there and adjust the weights as we go as those policy changes are made.
Can I clarify what the is to you?
So, okay.
So, yeah, because I think we could talk about total amount of funding versus current governance structure.
We have a lot of school districts.
Yeah.
And a lot of supervisory unions and a lot of small schools and some bigger schools that are small by national comparison. And a certain number of students and a certain number of paraeducators and all of those things. And in the And then some of what you are describing with regard to weights would apply to essentially paying for that existing formation. And you said something about not adding sort of additional financial stress or something like that. I'm not sure. I don't remember your exact words. And then we have a policy proposal with a timeline attached to it that would move to very different districts, very different school sizes, very different model of governance, maybe achieve the dream of a CTE system coordinated, right? All of those things, maybe deliver pre-K in every single elementary school. The move from what is to what the policy proposal is requires very different systems of funding. And I'm trying to understand which of the base and the weights you're sharing with us are trying to apply to this what is, and which of them are applying to this future state. And I just want to illuminate that I'm feeling a disconnect that I need to resolve in order to make good policy decisions in this room, so that even just labeling charts with like, these are weights and base for what is, and these are weights and base for the future state where we make our transformation, that would help even just like ask better questions.
I think that's great. And so thank you. And we want to be as collaborative as possible. And I know it's not perfectly, you're not, not having exact numbers makes it a little harder to be
I do think
collaborative.
it's good for us to not have exact numbers.
Yeah.
I really want to say as many times as possible.
I want to say like the pushing and pulling and tearing at and kind of finding our hole. That's exactly what we need. And we really appreciate that. So I just want to put that out there. To talk it through, we think that, and I'll just say the base is for, not just it's for the future, right? That's the number we think is kind of the base amount that would be needed in either system. And really everything we're talking about for the most part would be in existence in the future system with, and so just like the base, that's the base. The EL weight, that would be the EL weight. The at-risk weight would be the at-risk weight. CTE, new governance system, that would be part of it. And when I say the new system, that's, starting in, I believe, FY 28 is the goal, is when that would happen. So we are thinking of all of this being able to be used in what the current proposal is, the 5-district system. Really, the biggest couple of things I think we need to talk about is we think, again, like that school size adjustment, and we'll, make sure we have it laid out correctly, would be the right adjustment for school scale in current or in the future. And all we are saying is that because we know there's no way by FY 28 to make the school size changes that are likely needed, we would want to ensure that the system doesn't provide too few resources to the, to the new 5 districts. And that, I don't know what the number you all going to make this policy, but let's say 2 years out, we turn on and back on this definition for necessarily small schools, then only a subset of those current schools would get that funding. The goal of the new districts would be to create alignment to where they can actually get to more scale with schools during whatever that window of time is. And as policymakers and stakeholders, defining what is necessarily small. And so to Amanda's point, like, is it the current construct, or is it a distance from, another school? Is it, well, we're actually pretty close, but we have 2 schools that each only hold 75 kids, and thus, unless there's facilities dollars, we are necessary, like doing some of that. So the vast majority of what we're laying out here is going to be in both, right? It is, but it would come in FY 28, and we might need to make some guardrails about how it's used in the future, but all of it would really be there. I think clearly there's conversations about the pre-K policy that have to be done. I think there's cleaning up our definitions and making sure we're running all the information correctly. When we talked about the school, like making sure we got the right on the school sizes. I think there's some conversation about the density piece, right? But the majority of this we would see, 5-6 years out. This is exactly, obviously adjusted for inflation and everything else. This is what we're doing. And then you want to put in place, like, when do you reassess, right? A good school finance policy isn't waiting, probably not 2 years later, like we're doing right now necessarily, right? But, you're 5 years or every 5 years, every 10 years. I think there's a lot of really good questions about how frequently would you want to look at the base, right? Do you every year, Arkansas, has their legislative staff go into the model every year, recost it out, take a look at what other states are doing to see if you would adjust in certain ways, right? And they actually recreate the base based on looking at that. And since you have an explicit base, you could do that. But, I'm getting a little further than your question, but, ideally, everything we've laid out, or the vast majority of it, can be used, starting on FY 28, and then you need to adjust some of the parameters to make sure that it's applied correctly.
And again, you said all, and then you said the vast majority. And so as we go forward, really
Yeah.
having that clearly differentiated will help us do our jobs better. I also just want to, I think right now, the Joint Fiscal Office is working very hard to understand just what you modeled.
Yep.
And to help us as legislators ask the questions we need to on the model. Their role is not to sort of help you make the model better. That would be a sort of a different role for them than they are accustomed to playing or statutorily do. Yeah. Okay, we are in questions, everyone. I am going to stop talking. Thank you for your patience. I'm going to see if anyone who hasn't spoken yet. Yes, Representative Watson.
Not a trick question nor a trap question.
Oh.
When we talk about, or when you've talked about, we will eventually see real numbers of what, do you have those numbers now and they're just not ready to be rolled out in prime time, or are they still underdeveloped?
We have them now. There's a couple of things we're still working on, but vast majority we have.
Yeah, Representative Higdon.
I think during our joint meeting with the Senate over in the pavilion, there was somebody who mentioned maybe they were talking about that base amount or whatever, maybe not, maybe more than that, but tying it to the consumer price index or something. Is there any consideration for that form of bump? Or are you really looking at what you just said, looking at each program or whatever individually and making a change?
I think it's a really good policy decision. I would say a lot of the numbers we've used, if they're in previous years, we used, was it NEPA or NEEP? So the adjustment you currently use to do that inflation. A lot of states set their periodic reviews. And then in between that time, they do exactly that. They pick whatever their inflation adjustment is, and they apply that to the base. And what's great about a foundation formula is that once you've adjusted the base, all the weights flow off of it. So they then are also by definition adjusted for inflation. And so that is a policy decision really that you all as a legislature would make, is how frequently to review and then what to do with the numbers in between that time. But that is a really common and kind of best practice approach to at least have that kind of inflation adjustment year to year.
Thank you.
Representative.
How did you think about teacher pay equity and how did that flow into the base? I mean, do you say another word about how you thought about that? Because that could be a very complex thing in a state where there is such a lack of equity. I mean, both between different districts, but also between teachers at different points in their careers.
So there's probably kind of two pieces here. So for the foundation, or for the base amount and the foundation formula, we looked at using that additional, a higher salary rate than what is used in the PICUS-Auden model. So that increases the base to increase teacher salaries throughout. That doesn't take care of the teacher equity piece. So one of the things we've been asked to do, and it was actually asked also in our meeting last week where we were remotely, where there was a number of committees, is to take a look at what do other states do around kind of a common teacher's salary schedule. We will write this up, but we have taken a look. There's 14 states who have a teacher salary schedule. They are all minimum salary schedules. And so I think that's really key. In every state, other than Hawaii, which is a single district state, it's every teacher would make at least that minimum, but local districts could pay more. So we'll bring that information back. That's probably kind of the most transparent way to start thinking about teacher equity, is having those floors around pay. And then I think, and again, that's a different policy decision than necessarily linked to the base.
But when you're factoring in how many teachers at what salary in the base to say this is enough resources for a kid in any district.
Yeah.
How does that work? I'm just.
Yeah, I mean,
something's not working for me. Sorry.
yeah, the practice generally is to use the statewide salary. Here we've used statewide salary, statewide average salary plus. What that really guarantees though, of course, is that any district who's below or is above the statewide average salary is going to be able to pump in more dollars and
That are below this.
That below the average salary would be able to pump in more dollars. Anyone who's above it, it would be a little bit less. So that's kind of the best practice. That's where districts would still have to make decisions about staffing and compensation. And so those districts would still be making that piece. If you really want to get to every teacher making a minimum amount or more, that is where statewide salary schedules come into play and these minimum salary schedules.
Well, it's also complicated because of contracts though, because not just like the district gets to go and say, this is what we're gonna pay. Those are all negotiated contracts. Like those are all negotiated still at every single district. My question is then, and I'm sorry, I'm coming from this perspective. I'm coming from a district that pays teachers very much. And so I'm trying to just get my brain around how that works if we're trying to bring everyone to an average. Do we then end up having to go out and raise in our community from the tax base an additional amount on top of the foundation formula to make up for the fact that we're well above the average salary for the state?
I think there's really two things would have to happen. You'd have to resource a little differently, right? If the average class size in the model is 25-1, you might have to go to 26 or 27-1, right? So there's different ways different districts decide to do that. I think with this bigger policy change, and we've been talking about it, going from all the districts you have now to 5, right? Just thinking about which teacher contract within each of those 5 is going to be a big shift, right? That alone, and you, I'm sure, have wide variation in pay with the current districts who will go into this 5. So it is an absolutely huge conversation on the implementation side.
To clarify for the sort of the original question, I think
Yeah.
our follow-up questions were really important as well. You took, for the model itself, you took the average teacher salary and added some sum of money to it?
Yes, so if you look at the PICUS on model, their average teacher salaries, I believe the report says that came from the Agency of Education. We used all those and then for teacher salaries increased the sum.
By how much?
We will, that is part of the.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Can I just want to
Yes.
reinforce something that Justin said. So I think to your point about, we have a district that actually pays our teachers more. How do you do that? In other states, knowing what your district allocation is going to be, you make choices as a district then, if what you want to do is pay more, then you would maybe make some choices. I think that was a perfect example. If the base is run off of a 25-1 class size, but you're saying we want to prioritize a little bit higher teacher pay, then maybe you move to a 26 or a 27 to 1 teacher class size. And that's now what you're prioritizing there is you want to ensure that you have like highly effective teachers, teacher retention, rewarding good practice, right? And those highly effective teachers are maybe able to handle 1 or 2 more students. Those are the kinds of choices that get made in other states when you have this sort of allocation ahead of time. Because, and again, I want to reiterate something that Amanda said early on. We don't want to get caught up in the idea that the base is prescriptive. It's not thou shalt hire 2 interventionists per 100 students. You may make a different choice within your district or your school community, because you may have, we are doing a strategic initiative to support SEL for all students. Therefore, this interventionist is actually going to become a SEL coordinator. So the base is there, an evidence-based model to assure that students have a high quality education. But within that, there was a lot of ability to customize for need. And that's one of the strategies that other districts use in other states to achieve high. And again, that bigger region, the regional district, I think is critical. It's really hard when we're doing this work to kind of get ourselves out of our current box. But if we're dealing with 5 regions, then all of a sudden you actually are dealing with much of you can make these adjustments.
Representative Odie, you were next, and then Representative Butler.
I have so many questions.
Oh, and actually, I'm so sorry, right before you ask your question, Justin, do you need to leave right now?
I've got 6 more minutes, so
Okay.
I apologize. I have a flight.
If you leave in the middle of a conversation, I just want to make sure everyone knows that you're not leaving for
Drive them away.
It won't be a cost this time. It will be, yeah.
You told me you need to leave at 2:30, so if you walk out and we just
Appreciate
keep
that.
going, yes, thank you very much for your time. That
Okay.
Oh, good to know.
Perfect.
Representative Odie, your question. Thank you.
I'm very disturbed about the last discussion, but
Mhm.
so did you do you account for cost of living in each of the new 5 territories?
We do not have an adjustment for cost of living in the formula as of yet. It's something that could be explored, I would say. Nationally, there's about 13 states that do include a cost of living adjustment in their system. They can be challenging to implement in smaller settings, but it's not, yeah.
But when I hear that a school board would have a choice, school board doesn't have a choice about deciding how much to spend on teacher contracts when you're already in teacher contracts, and everybody's at salary level. So if you, to my mind, I would hope you would think about cost of living in different places, and that when you start a new formula, you need to index that formula in some way at where people are starting today. Otherwise, there is no choice involved. It is high salary, must cut. That's it.
I think this might be more for the agency.
Then let's,
Okay, yep.
we're going to spend lots of time with the agency in this session. Yes, Representative Kimball.
So forgive me, it's 44 states currently have a foundation formula, right?
36 states have a foundation formula.
Okay. So I guess I'm wondering, this is a different way to pay for education than we're doing now. So we could actually adopt this right now without doing all the structural changes, theoretically. Right?
Absolutely.
I don't think it would result in any cost savings, however. Right?
Not necessarily.
So I guess for those states that have implemented a foundation formula, what has been the worst outcomes and the best outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that a lot of states have used the foundation formula for decades, right? And so I think it's hard to say like what's worked or what hasn't worked. It's been the is, for a long time. I think what has been the reason a number of states have done this recently, and I'm going to mention states that everybody wants to be like Mississippi and Tennessee, but those are states whose formulas historically were not very equitable in getting additional dollars to their higher need populations. And so they've made a shift to a foundation formula, most specifically to get more dollars moving towards their at-risk and EL population. So that's probably the best thing that can happen with foundation formulas it's more transparent about a student in this district versus a student in that district, if they have the same needs, generating the same dollars. I think kind of the worst case scenario, and this I think really comes to mind, and you have to think about with Brigham here, is those places who've put in a foundation formula, allowed additional dollars to go, to be generated over the top, have not done a good job keeping up the formula over time. And I will use Colorado, where I live, as an example. Their original foundation formula allowed for a 5% additional local dollars to be raised. The state struggled to keep their foundation formula going with inflation. And so today you can have 25% more dollars locally, right? So they've exploded inequity because they've allowed the extra to be more important than the formula. And I think that's really the worst case scenario over time.
And have there been places where there are effective caps that limit the impact of that?
Yes, and more on the when folks go for additional dollars, they are equalized in doing it. So it's not, so it's not, well, we're really wealthy, we don't have to
Right, you don't
do
get-
much and I can raise a bunch.
Somebody else.
It's equalizing that. So that's really one of the key ways to do it. And then I think keeping the constraint at the top of the additional, doing both of those would be really key.
And have those caps worked in other places?
I need to go and dig a little bit more because not every state even allows it. But we can definitely keep digging on that.
Thanks.
I have another best practice question. The decision that you all made in this model that you handed us, and then sort of thoughts from other states about when to put something in base, when to put something in a weight, and when to put something in a block grant.
Yeah. I will answer in my 1 minute and then Amanda will give a much smarter answer. Again, I think the base, what you're really trying to understand trying to calculate is what is, again, a student with no special needs in a district with no special circumstances, right? So that would be as best as you can get the base, right? So if you're going to have much smaller districts, that, that adjustment's not in the base. If you have at-risk students, that money's not in the base. So anything that is going to differ, either student characteristic or district characteristic, we like to see in the weights as much as possible, because that hopefully the state is increasing that base every year, which means those weights will also increase. What we've seen with categorical grants, which can be great, right? And having the special education census block grant is good. But what we have seen in other states is that they can sometimes start to die on the vine, right? You put 50 million in for something, and 10 years later, it's still 50 million for the same service, and you have 100% more kids who are receiving it, right? So it devalues what's happening there. But what is really good about categorical grants is this is for special ed. We're targeting it for special ed. We can track it through the uniform chart of accounts, and those dollars are coming back out the other side, right? So that's where I think and Amanda is an expert on uniform chart of accounts. I want to thank you guys for the time. If you need something else from us, just let us know too. Amanda will be here, but happy to talk anytime. Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have another 15 minutes of testimony here, folks. Representative Messer.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I've heard a number of members around the committee in different ways express the same thing, which is how might this be updated over time? For instance, if, as you say, Madam Chair, it could be come out with a perfect version of what's in weights, what's in blocks, what's in adjustments. And we could be satisfied with it in April. But then what happens, and that's where the fighting starts, I think, in year 2 or 3. Right. And we're not going to adjust that, figure that out right now. But it is certainly something to keep in mind as we go forward. And that's my short point on this one. But it's something that's going to be of a concern to many people around the state.
No, I think it's very valid.
And I think there's actually, there was some valuable work on sort of what recalibration looks like, what super sort of focusing big picture on the ed finance system looks like all in 127 that hasn't taken, those pieces haven't taken effect yet.
From that in itself,
Yeah.
it's good work. This is all good. It's just, we find little wrinkles everywhere we go.
Yes, the details matter. Further questions for the witness? Yeah, absolutely.
So in many of the other states, are you finding that, I mean, years ago, it used to be that schools and towns would look at growth potential. Are you finding that it's kind of the opposite now where, Vermont, we're losing students? Is that across the board pretty much?
Yeah, I would say declining enrollment is not unique to Vermont. We're seeing that across the country. Obviously, different communities are impacted differently. Your rural communities may experience something different than urban communities, but I think nationally the conversation is around how do you deal with declining enrollment, which is families having less kids, and how do you think about doing that? So Vermont is in good company with everyone else.
And again, the foundation formula, let's say there was a community that for some reason individuals wanted to go to more than others. Does the foundation formula really allow for that sort of expansion with all the calculations and maybe even in the actual school facility itself? How does something like that be adjusted or?
Yeah, so I think I'll have to set facility to the side because the formula is really designed to address kind of ongoing costs. So kind of your capital construction or your major facility needs would be outside of a formula. And so just what's in the formula is really that kind of ongoing maintenance and operations amount at a level to make sure you don't end up with larger deferred maintenance capital issues down the line. So just setting that aside, I think the piece around the funding system and choice is another one where I make a little distinction between what the funding formula does and what the larger policy does. So I think, and Jill can probably speak to some of this, but moving to right now, you have kind of two kinds of choice that's happening in your system, and that's kind of choice between public schools. So you have not a lot, but some districts that are non-operational, they don't operate their own schools, or they only operate elementary schools. So then their students are attending schools in other districts. When you move to the larger regional settings, I think you'll see a lot less of that kind of within school or not, but within public school kind of choice to choice between buildings. And again, because you'll be now operating a full K through 12 spectrum in your new kind of 5 regional districts. I think the larger question on then families choosing outside of the public school system is a bigger policy question than the formula answers itself. And Jill, I don't know if there's anything else you want
No,
to
I
say.
think that's a fair answer. It is a bigger policy question. I think, Brett Carnheiser can come in and address that separately, but it is absolutely a policy question.
Important question.
Thank you.
And so as we make the transformation of sizes and classrooms and districts, there will be, as you said, like fairly massive facility needs, and those are not accounted for in any of the numbers we're going to be receiving.
They are not, only the ongoing piece of facilities would be accounted for. But a really important conversation. So
Thank you. Representative Holcomb.
To verify, make sure I understand on the special education students, when you refer to the adjustment to reflect the portion of special education costs that are not addressed through the census block grant,
Mhm.
I assume you're talking about the 70 million or so for the 700 kids who get extraordinary expenditures.
When we say that, we think about what is currently being spent on special education in districts right now
Mhm.
and how much they're receiving through the census block grants and through federal funds.
Mhm.
There's a delta, a difference between what they're receiving and what they're paying out for special education. So it was a broader thought than just extraordinary cost students.
So you might have to add that into the funding. too.
That's what we're still thinking about is how do you address that delta? And there's, as everyone knows, special education is a very kind of thorny piece of funding as you think about federal requirements around maintenance of fiscal support and maintenance of effort for spending at district levels. Just how do you account for that? We're still really working through right now.
And similarly, did
Yeah,
your
thanks.
weights for students who are disadvantaged, do you account for federal funding in establishing those weights as well?
That would be separate from it. We do know there are additional resources that are available for students. We try to just be very careful with the supplement versus supplant as we think about what funding is needed to support those students. So it's both recognizing that they are additional dollars are available, but not discounting the amount of funding that a state should provide because they exist, if that makes sense.
So I'm trying, how do you arrive at these particular rates for disadvantaged students without accounting for those, or supplementing those federal funds?
It was thinking about what resources do they need to be in schools.
And did you account for federal funds in that when you were thinking about what resources they need?
We accounted for knowing that there are additional funding sources that are available for them. But what we're seeing when we look at
I'm sorry, so you set the weight without thinking about federal funds? Yes or no?
we set the weight based on the work that's been done by researchers on what should be in schools.
That's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking when you figure out how much, you've made a decision in the Pikes report or wherever it was about what it costs to educate a student who's disadvantaged. And we are layering a series of funding streams to reach that. When you layer to estimate the weight needed above whatever base you're using.
We would be
To
saying
educate
the
them.
portion that needs to be funded by the state, not from federal sources.
So you're saying you're supplementing.
We are not supplementing. It's awareness. You need to establish as a state what resources do you want to provide to your students, absent of the federal funds being available. Because if you take them into account, then you're supplanting. So that's where I said you want to be cognizant that there's probably other available resources, but you want to make sure as a state, you are providing the resources that you want to have for your students.
Maybe it'll become clearer when we see the map.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Further questions, folks? Okay, I think our brains are full up.
We have a lot of information.
Is there anything else you want to share with us? I imagine next time we see you, you'll be inside a little box inside the screen right there.
Yes, no, more information will be forthcoming. I really appreciated your thoughts as we're refining.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
This might be for you. I'm not sure. Do we have a timeline? Like, are we looping baback in a week with more?
We're gonna keep on doing our work, and as the Agency of Education gets us more resources to do our work, we will incorporate that into our work. So today's Thursday still, yeah, that's true. Okay, so we are going to the floor at 3:00. You should head to the floor at 2:50 because that is our new protocol, so that we are all on the floor sitting in our seats at 3:00 so that floor can start on time. After the floor, we are staying in our seats on the floor for 2 separate trainings, not coming back to this room unless that is your desire, but I won't be sitting here. And then tomorrow morning, we are here at 9 a.m. to finish our work on the budget adjustment.